Eliza had always longed for quiet, a silence deep enough to hear her own thoughts, to mend the cracks in her soul that had formed over the past few months. So, when the opportunity to rent the small apartment in the crumbling old building near the edge of town presented itself, she jumped at it without hesitation. The place was perfect, isolated yet not too far from the heart of the city, tucked away from the rush of life that seemed to have trampled her spirit. The apartment itself was a quaint one-bedroom, with creaky hardwood floors and a view of the mist-covered river. The landlord, a quiet, elderly man with pale, thin skin, had warned her not to disturb the mirror in the hallway. "It's an antique," he said, with an air of finality that made Eliza laugh. "Just don't touch it too much. It's been here a long time." She hadn't paid much attention to his words. After all, who would be scared of an old mirror? The glass was smudged, and its wooden frame was chipped in places. It looked as if it had been forgotten, left behind in the hallway for decades. Eliza was certain it would be one of the first things she would cover with a blanket or a cloth, anything to keep it from staring at her with its dark, empty eyes. But she couldn't bring herself to do it. She wasn't one for superstition. Perhaps it was the fact that the rest of the apartment was so charming that she couldn't bear to cover the one thing that seemed so oddly out of place. Instead, she left it be, even as she tried to ignore the way it seemed to watch her whenever she passed by. The first night was uneventful. She unpacked her things, made herself a cup of tea, and settled into the small but cozy living room. There was something calming about the sound of the wind howling outside, the steady rhythm of the rain tapping on the window panes. She imagined it would take no time to get used to the solitude. But as she prepared for bed, she noticed something strange. The mirror, which had been positioned just outside her bedroom, was now ever so slightly off-center. The edge of the frame was tilted in a way that suggested someone had moved it. Her heart skipped a beat. She had not touched it, of course. Eliza frowned and walked over to straighten it. The second her fingers brushed against the cool surface of the glass, she felt a sudden jolt, like a brief shiver of energy racing up her spine. It was nothing, she told herself. Just nerves. She straightened the mirror with a snap and turned away, heading back to her room. She tried to shake the unease creeping into her thoughts, telling herself that it was simply the stress of the move, the quietness, the unfamiliar surroundings. But as she lay in bed, the feeling lingered. The mirror, no matter how she tried to ignore it, was there. A presence in the hallway that seemed to call to her, though not in any way she could define. It wasn't a voice, not exactly, but she could feel it, like the weight of eyes watching her every move. She pulled the blanket tighter around her shoulders, closing her eyes against the feeling. "Sleep," she told herself. "Sleep, and everything will feel better in the morning." But sleep never came. Throughout the night, Eliza tossed and turned, disturbed by a constant rustling sound. It was soft at first, like a whispering breeze, but gradually, it grew louder, closer. The hairs on the back of her neck stood on end as the sound began to resemble something more distinct, more human, the quiet shuffle of footsteps. "Impossible," she murmured to herself, blinking into the darkness. She wasn't sure if she'd imagined it, but the sound felt real. It felt like someone, or something, was walking just outside her bedroom door. In the darkness, a cold chill swept through the room, and Eliza's gaze flicked toward the hallway. She could just make out the faint outline of the mirror, its surface glinting in the low light. And for the briefest moment, she could have sworn that she saw something move in the reflection. The next morning, Eliza stood in the kitchen, the hum of the kettle the only sound in the otherwise silent apartment. The sun had begun to rise, casting a muted light through the narrow windows, but something about the stillness in the air made the warmth of the sunlight feel more distant than it should have. She told herself it had been nothing, a dream, a trick of the night. The footsteps, the strange sensation that something had been watching her, it was all just her overactive imagination. The move had been stressful, and the isolation of the apartment was bound to affect her. People weren't meant to live in places that were too quiet, too empty. Perhaps it was the silence that made the little creaks and groans of an old building seem so loud. Yet, despite the reassuring words she told herself, she could not shake the lingering unease that had settled into her chest. It was a feeling she couldn't quite describe, but it hovered like a fog in the back of her mind. She tried to ignore it as she sipped her tea, staring out the window at the morning mist rolling over the river. It was when she stood up to pour more tea that she caught it again, the faintest movement. From the corner of her eye, Eliza glimpsed the mirror. It was as if it had drawn her attention, even though she hadn't looked at it consciously. She had been so careful to ignore it, yet there it was, almost mocking her. Her heart raced as she turned toward it, feeling that same sharp jolt of unease she had felt the night before. The reflection was not the same as the one she saw in the mirror before. Eliza stared, her breath catching in her throat. Her own reflection stood there, just like she expected. But her eyes, wide and filled with confusion, were looking back at her with a depth of emotion she had never seen before, emotion that wasn't hers. Her reflection smiled. It wasn't a playful, innocent smile. No, this was something darker, something unsettling. The corners of her reflection's mouth stretched unnaturally wide, as though it was enjoying a private joke that Eliza wasn't a part of. Frozen, Eliza couldn't tear her eyes away. Her own body stood motionless in the reflection, but her reflection, it was moving. It tilted its head slightly, as though studying her, its eyes widening even more with an intensity that felt too deep, too knowing. In a single, swift motion, her reflection raised a finger to its lips, as though telling her to be quiet. It didn't blink, didn't look away. It only stood there, smiling that same unnerving smile. "Stop it," Eliza whispered under her breath. She stepped back, her pulse quickening. Her fingers reached out to grab the edge of the hallway wall, but it felt as though the air itself was pressing in on her. The hairs on her arms prickled. For a moment, she thought she might collapse. It was as though the mirror had consumed the room, the whole apartment, and she was trapped in it, her reflection the only real thing she could see. But then, just as quickly as the sensation had come, it faded. The smile vanished. The reflection returned to normal, mimicking her every move as it always had. Still shaken, Eliza slowly turned away from the mirror, her heart pounding in her chest. Her mind raced, a whirlwind of thoughts too fast to catch. What had she just seen? A trick of the light, perhaps, or some psychological effect of her nerves. Maybe the mirror was just, well, old. She tried to convince herself it was nothing more than a glitch in her perception, but the weight of the experience lingered. No. Something had happened. Something beyond simple logic. For the rest of the day, Eliza did her best to keep busy. She unpacked the last of her boxes, cleaned the kitchen, and even rearranged the furniture in an attempt to distract herself. But each time she walked past the hallway, her gaze was inevitably drawn to the mirror. And each time, it felt like the mirror was watching her back, waiting for her to make the slightest mistake. By evening, the chill that had begun to settle into her bones was impossible to ignore. The apartment felt colder now, and the quiet seemed to press in on her. It wasn't the peaceful stillness she had longed for. It was suffocating, unsettling. As night began to fall, Eliza made herself dinner, trying to ignore the way the shadows stretched longer with the fading light. She turned on every light in the apartment, but it didn't help. The darkness outside seemed to creep closer. She had barely finished her meal when she heard it again, the soft, almost imperceptible sound of footsteps. Her body tensed, the fork halfway to her mouth. She glanced over her shoulder, but no one was there. It was impossible. She had checked every inch of the apartment, and yet it felt as though someone, or something, was walking just outside her door. Nervously, she stood up and approached the hallway. The mirror, dark and looming, awaited her. She could feel its presence in her chest, a pressure that made her stomach tighten. Her reflection waited for her. Eliza slowly stepped toward the mirror. She couldn't explain why, but she had to look. She had to know. This time, she was ready. She steadied herself, focusing on her reflection. It looked back at her with the same vacant, hollow eyes, mimicking every movement. But then, just as she thought everything was normal again, her reflection did something it shouldn't have. It blinked. But Eliza hadn't moved a muscle. Her reflection was supposed to mirror her perfectly, but now it seemed to be doing things on its own. Her breath hitched in her throat. And this time, she swore, it smiled. The following morning, Eliza could hardly bring herself to leave her bed. Her body felt heavy, as though it was made of stone, every movement a deliberate effort. The chill that had settled over her the night before seemed to linger still, clinging to her skin like a second layer. It was a new kind of exhaustion, one that wasn't from lack of sleep, but from the sheer weight of the dread that had crept into her life. She hadn't slept. Not really. After the incident with the mirror, After the reflection's unsettling smile and its silent, knowing stare, she hadn't dared to close her eyes for long. Every time she drifted off, the echo of the footsteps, the strange, soft shuffle, slithered through her dreams, only to wake her moments later with her heart pounding in her chest. She had tried to tell herself it was nothing, that she was simply overtired, that the mirror was playing tricks on her, distorted reflections, shadows, the kind of thing any nervous mind could conjure. But deep down, Eliza knew the truth. Something was wrong. Something in that apartment was wrong, and it was tethered to that mirror. At breakfast, her mind wandered to the thought of leaving. Perhaps she should go back to the city, find a place in a bustling neighborhood, surrounded by noise and movement. There, in the noise, the shadow of whatever haunted her here might remain locked in the quiet corners of the old building, unseen and felt. But Eliza quickly dismissed the thought. She had nowhere else to go. And besides, running felt like an admission of defeat. She would confront it. Confront whatever was lurking in that mirror. Shaking off the weight of the morning, she stood, preparing to leave for the day. As she walked past the hallway, she glanced at the mirror, only to freeze in her tracks. It wasn't the same. The reflection wasn't her own. Her stomach twisted as she took a step closer. Her reflection was no longer mirroring her movements in the way it should have. Instead, it stood still, its eyes focused directly on her, unblinking, unnervingly fixed on her every move. But it wasn't just the eyes. It was the way it watched. Like it was waiting. A flicker of fear crawled up her spine. She could feel her own heart rate quicken as the silence between them stretched too long. "Who are you?" Eliza whispered, though she immediately regretted it. What kind of question was that? But something in her had snapped. The mirror was no longer just an object, no longer just a reflection of her, it had become something else entirely. Something aware. Something with a mind of its own. And then, she heard it. A faint sound, barely audible, but unmistakably there. A whisper. "Leave, now." Her breath caught in her throat. It had come from the mirror, from the reflection itself. She could hear it so clearly in her mind that it was as if the words were her own thoughts. Yet they were not. They were not hers. They were coming from there, from within the mirror. Eliza stumbled back, her feet tangling in the hallway, but her eyes were glued to the glass. The reflection didn't move, it simply watched, the smile creeping back onto its face, like it knew something she didn't. "Get out," the voice came again, louder this time, like a command. She wasn't sure if the words were in her head or in the air, but they seemed to vibrate through the walls, through her very bones. Eliza's breath quickened, panic bubbling in her chest. She turned and fled down the hall, not daring to look back, as though doing so might allow the reflection to follow her. Her mind was racing with thoughts of escape, of getting away from the mirror and whatever was inside it. But even as she stumbled away, her eyes kept being drawn to the hall behind her, as if the mirror was silently calling her back. For the rest of the day, Eliza tried to keep herself busy, distracting herself with tasks, anything to avoid the looming presence of the mirror. She scrubbed the floors, rearranged the furniture again, and even dusted every surface she could find, as though the act of cleaning could somehow rid the apartment of the lingering feeling of dread. But the moment she walked past the hallway, her heart would race, her skin would prickle, and she could feel the mirror's eyes on her. By evening, she could no longer ignore the feeling that something was watching her, no longer a vague sense of unease, but a pressing, overwhelming certainty. It was as if every time she passed the hallway, she could hear the whispering again, so faint, so distant, but there. Always there. "Leave, now." But this time, there was more. As Eliza turned to head back to her bedroom, she stopped in her tracks. The mirror had shifted again. It was as if it had moved. She wasn't sure how or when, but it was now slightly turned toward the left, angling as if to follow her every step. And then, just as she caught her breath, she saw it again. The flicker of movement in the reflection, only this time, it wasn't her own image that stood there. A figure stood beside her in the reflection, a shadowy shape barely distinguishable from the dark of the glass itself. For one heartbeat, Eliza thought her heart had stopped. She wanted to run, to scream, to leave, but she was paralyzed. The reflection of the shadowy figure stepped closer to her own mirrored self, its features obscured. The whispering began again, this time clearer, like it was coming from the shadow itself. "You're not supposed to be here." Eliza gasped, her knees weakening beneath her as she stumbled back toward the door. "You're not supposed to be here." The words rang through her mind, and the air grew colder. Something was pulling her in. The mirror wasn't just a reflection anymore. It was alive. And it was not alone. Eliza barely slept that night, her mind too twisted in knots to find any rest. She stayed huddled under the covers, the blanket pulled high over her shoulders, her eyes darting nervously between the shadows that seemed to stretch unnaturally long in the corners of her bedroom. Every creak of the floorboards, every faint gust of wind outside her window felt amplified, charged with an eerie energy she couldn't shake. She didn't dare look at the mirror again, not after the shadow she had seen lurking beside her reflection. The whispering had stopped for a while, but its absence left a void, a quiet that felt far more ominous than the whispers themselves. Eliza could still hear the words echoing in her mind, like an insistent chant. "You're not supposed to be here." What did it mean? Who was it that spoke to her from the reflection? Was the mirror alive? By morning, she knew she couldn't stay in that apartment anymore. The tension in her chest was unbearable, the air too thick with a presence she couldn't see but could feel closing in around her. But before she could make any decision to leave, something strange happened. The kitchen, which she had left spotless the night before, was now in disarray. She stood frozen in the doorway, staring at the scene in disbelief. The table was littered with overturned chairs, the once neatly stacked dishes scattered across the floor. There was no sign of forced entry. The windows were locked, the doors secure. But the mess, it didn't make sense. "Eliza!" The voice came from behind her, soft and breathy, like the rustle of leaves in a forgotten forest. She spun around, her pulse pounding in her ears, but no one was there. Her heart raced, and she instinctively reached for the doorframe to steady herself. The air felt thick, almost suffocating, as though the room itself was holding its breath. "Eliza!" The voice came again, more distinct now, and this time it seemed to come from the mirror. Eliza's eyes flicked toward it, and to her horror, the surface of the glass rippled. Like water disturbed by a stone, the reflection shimmered, and in the distorted image, she saw something that made her blood run cold. A face, pale and gaunt, stared back at her from the mirror. It wasn't her face. It wasn't even the shadowy figure she had seen before. This was something different, something worse. The eyes were wide and hollow, the skin stretched thin over bone, and the mouth was twisted into a grotesque, unnatural grin. The figure's lips moved, though it made no sound. "Eliza," it whispered again, the voice now a rasping, guttural thing. "You have to listen." Her breath caught in her throat as the figure's face seemed to press closer to the glass, its features distorting further until it seemed to be pressing against the mirror's surface, as though trying to claw its way through. With a scream, Eliza stumbled backward, but the mirror, the thing inside it, followed her. The air in the room felt colder, as if the temperature had dropped 20 degrees in an instant. A sudden noise broke the silence. A soft knock, coming from the front door. Eliza's heart skipped a beat. Who could it be? She didn't want to open the door. She didn't want anyone to see her like this, not when she felt like she was losing her mind. But the knocking continued, insistent, growing louder, until it seemed to shake the very walls of the apartment. She glanced at the mirror one last time. The face was gone, but she could still feel its presence, hovering just behind the glass, waiting, watching. She quickly turned away, hurrying to the door, though every step felt like it was dragging her deeper into the nightmare. When she opened the door, the hallway outside was empty. No one was there. Just the usual dim light filtering through the cracks of the old building, the familiar creaks and groans that had become the soundtrack to her isolation. But then she saw it. A small, crumpled piece of paper was lying just outside the door, as if someone had slipped it under. Trembling, Eliza bent down to pick it up. The paper was yellowed and worn, as though it had been handled by many hands over the years. She unfolded it slowly, her breath hitching in her chest. Written in faded ink, the message was clear. "It watches you. It always has. You are not alone." Eliza's heart hammered against her ribs as she stared at the note, unable to move. The words seemed to burn into her mind, searing themselves into her memory. She had heard that voice before. She had seen that face. It had been in the mirror. For a moment, Eliza stood frozen in the hallway, the note trembling in her hands, until the sound of something scraping against the wall snapped her out of her trance. The mirror. She couldn't run. She couldn't hide anymore. She had to face it. She had to know what was happening. With trembling hands, Eliza turned and walked slowly back to the hallway, the weight of the note still pressing down on her. She stopped in front of the mirror, her reflection staring back at her, still calm, still normal. But the whispers began again, soft and insistent. "Eliza, it's time." Eliza closed her eyes. She had to look. She had to know what the mirror wanted, what the voice wanted, what it had been trying to show her all this time. And when she opened her eyes again, the reflection was gone. There was nothing but darkness behind the glass. The darkness behind the glass seemed to swallow Eliza whole. Her breath caught in her throat, and her heart pounded in her chest, deafening her to everything except the emptiness that stretched endlessly within the mirror. The world around her faded, the walls of the apartment seeming to dissolve into a mist of shadows. The air grew heavy, thick with the feeling that something was reaching through, something that didn't belong in this world. "Eliza." The whisper came again, now stronger, clearer. It was like the voice was wrapping itself around her, threading through her thoughts like a familiar presence. Her hands trembled, her fingers digging into the wooden frame of the mirror as though it might anchor her to reality, but the pull of the darkness was relentless. It was as if the mirror had become a window to something much worse, to a place that was not meant to be seen. Her eyes scanned the dark, looking for some sign of what lay beyond, and then she saw it. A figure, a shape moving within the darkness of the mirror. It was there, but not quite. It flickered in and out of view, like a phantom caught between worlds. Eliza's breath hitched in her throat as the figure stepped closer, its form becoming more defined. It was tall, unnaturally so, its limbs elongated and twisted, as if stretched beyond the limits of the human body. "Eliza." The voice echoed through her mind once more, louder now, as if it had become something far more real. Something far more tangible. The figure in the mirror grinned, its mouth stretched too wide, far too wide for any normal face, the edges of its lips curling unnaturally. Eliza's eyes widened, and her pulse began to race faster. It was not a smile. It was something much more sinister, something grotesque. She could feel her legs giving way, the ground beneath her seeming to shift. The reflection wasn't just a reflection anymore. It was a doorway. It was pulling her in. And in that moment, Eliza understood what it was. It was the Watcher. It had been watching her all along. Watching from the other side of the mirror. Her body trembled as she took a step back, but her eyes were fixed on the mirror. The figure inside it seemed to be moving toward her, its shadowy form dragging itself closer, inch by agonizing inch. "No. I won't let it win." The thought surged through Eliza's mind, and for a fleeting moment, she gathered the strength to turn away from the mirror. She stumbled back, her legs nearly collapsing under her, but the door, her escape, was just a few steps away. But before she could reach it, the temperature in the room dropped. A freezing wind swirled through the apartment, swirling around her as if the air itself had become alive. Her breath came out in quick, panicked gasps, the chill biting into her skin like 1,000 icy needles. And then, she heard it, the sound of footsteps, muffled, distant, but unmistakably there. It was coming from behind her. "Eliza, you cannot escape." The voice was everywhere now, surrounding her, seeping into her very bones. The walls seemed to vibrate with its power, and she could feel the weight of the words pressing down on her, squeezing the breath from her lungs. She spun around, her body locking in place at the sight before her. The figure from the mirror was no longer just a reflection. It had stepped through. It stood there, its form now fully manifested in the room with her, the edges of its shadow stretching and shifting unnaturally. The thing that had been confined to the glass now filled the space, towering over her. Eliza gasped, her heart pounding violently as she stumbled backward, but there was nowhere to go. The apartment seemed to close in on her, the walls bending, warping, until she felt as though the very air was pressing against her skin. "You belong to me now," the thing rasped, its voice a distorted growl, jagged and broken, as though it had no business speaking in the way a human would. Eliza couldn't tear her eyes away. It was so much worse than she could have imagined. The thing that stood before her was not human, not even close. Its skin was a pale, ashen grey, stretched tight over bone, with sharp, jagged features that seemed too angular, too unnatural. Its eyes, those hollow, black pits, bore into her with a ferocity that stole all warmth from the room. She could feel it, too, the weight of its gaze. It wasn't just looking at her, it was inside her, as if it could see through her very soul. Her legs shook as she stumbled backward, her mind scrambling for a way out, for anything that could help her. But the door wasn't enough. There was no escape. She could feel it now, a tightening sensation in her chest, like invisible hands were wrapping around her heart, squeezing until she could barely breathe. Eliza, the figure's grin grew wider, impossibly wide, stretching to the edges of its face. The voice was no longer just in her mind. It was in the room, vibrating through her bones, flooding her senses. "You are mine." The last thing Eliza saw before her vision began to blur was its hand reaching out toward her. She opened her mouth to scream, but no sound came out. Only the darkness swallowed her whole. Eliza awoke in darkness. For a long, terrifying moment, she didn't know where she was. The air was thick, heavy, suffocating, and when she tried to move, she found herself paralyzed. It was as if something unseen pressed against her, held her down, kept her from escaping. Then, a flicker of light. It was faint, just a silvery glimmer, but it was enough to reveal something that made her blood run cold. She was inside the mirror. The realization slammed into her with the force of a tidal wave. Her breath came in ragged gasps as she tried to comprehend what had happened. The apartment, the watcher, the figure stepping through the glass. And then, darkness. Now, she was here. The space around her was infinite and empty, stretching far beyond what her eyes could see. The glass of the mirror formed the barrier between her and the world she had once known, but the world on this side, it was wrong. She turned slowly, trying to make sense of her surroundings. The space around her was a void, shifting and swirling with shadows, as though the very air was alive. And then, something moved in the distance. She wasn't alone. A shape slithered through the darkness, barely visible, its presence sending icy tendrils of dread through her spine. It was watching her. She could feel its gaze, the same way she had felt it when she had first looked into the mirror. Eliza. The voice was everywhere. It was not a whisper anymore. It was a growl, a rasping, ancient sound that vibrated through the space around her. She spun around, her breath catching in her throat. The figure was there. No longer distant, no longer an outline of something unseen. It stood right in front of her now. Eliza stumbled back, but the void did not allow her to move far. The figure tilted its head, its face twisted into that impossibly wide grin. Up close, she could see the skin wasn't real. It was more like something wearing skin, stretched over bone, pulled too tight over something that did not belong in a human shape. She tried to speak, but her throat clenched shut. "You are home now," the thing said. "No," she whispered, shaking her head. "No, this isn't real. This isn't happening." The thing laughed. A dry, hollow sound, as if laughter was something it had learned to mimic but had never truly understood. "You look too long," it said, taking a slow, deliberate step toward her. "You listened when you should have turned away. Now, you are one of us." Eliza's stomach twisted. One of us? She shook her head furiously, refusing to accept what it was saying. "I don't belong here," she said, her voice trembling but defiant. The creature stopped. Its empty, hollow eyes studied her, and for the first time, she saw something shift behind them, something deeper, something ancient and knowing. "You don't remember, do you?" it murmured. Eliza frowned. "Remember what?" The shadows around her stirred. The air grew even colder. And then, the glass of the mirror flickered, shifting like rippling water. And she saw it. A memory. A vision. A past she had long forgotten. She saw herself, but not in the present. A younger version of herself, a child, standing before the very same mirror. Her small hands pressed against the glass, her eyes wide with fascination. And behind her, just barely visible in the reflection, was the Watcher. A wave of nausea washed over her as the realization hit. She had seen it before. When she was young. She had stared too long back then, just as she had done now. And it had never left her. "You've always been watched," the creature whispered. "You were chosen long ago." Eliza staggered back. "No," she choked out. "That's not true. I don't remember. I would have known." "You forgot," the thing said, stepping closer. But the mirror never did. Eliza's breath was ragged now. She could feel the truth sinking in, wrapping around her like an iron chain. She had always felt like something had followed her, lingered in the quiet moments of her life. Had it always been watching, waiting for her to return to it? "No," she whispered again, shaking her head violently. "I'm not staying here." The figure let out a slow, guttural laugh. "You don't have a choice." Eliza's eyes darted to the glass, to the rippling vision of the apartment beyond it. Was there a way back? Could she escape? She lunged forward, pressing her hands against the surface, but the moment she touched it, pain ripped through her. It was like touching ice and fire at the same time, searing through her bones. A scream tore from her throat. "You cannot leave," the voice whispered. But Eliza refused to believe that. With all her strength, she slammed her fist against the glass. Once. Twice. Again. The surface shuddered, cracks spiderwebbing outward. The figure hissed, its grin faltering. Eliza saw her chance. With a final, desperate cry, she threw herself forward, shattering through the glass. And everything went black. Eliza's body slammed against something solid. For a moment, she felt weightless, like she had been thrown through the air, lost in the black void. But then, impact. Cold, hard, unyielding. Her lungs seized as she gasped for breath, her hands clawing at the floor beneath her. She was back. She could feel the floorboards beneath her palms, the familiar scent of her apartment's old wooden walls filling her nose. Her head spun as she slowly pushed herself up, her body trembling from the effort. The mirror lay in front of her, shattered. Hundreds of pieces of glass littered the floor, catching the dim light and scattering reflections in every direction. She exhaled a shaking breath, barely able to believe it. She had broken free. It was over. A bitter laugh escaped her lips, part relief, part disbelief. She turned toward the apartment door, every muscle in her body screaming for her to get up, to leave this cursed place. But as she reached for the doorknob, a chill ran down her spine. Something felt wrong. The air was still thick, heavy, as if the room itself was holding its breath. Slowly, cautiously, she turned back toward the broken mirror. And that's when she saw it. The reflections in the shards of glass, they weren't hers. Each fractured piece of mirror reflected something else. A different version of herself. Some were distorted, pale, gaunt, hollow-eyed. Others were twisted into monstrous shapes, their mouths stretched in silent screams. And then, in one of the larger shards, she saw her. The other her. Eliza's breath hitched. The woman staring back at her was identical to her in every way, but there was no emotion in her eyes. No warmth. Just a void. A cold, lifeless stare. Then, the reflection smiled. It was small at first. Subtle. But it grew wider, stretching far beyond what was natural, until it became that same impossible, nightmarish grin she had seen in the mirror before. Eliza staggered back. "No," she whispered. The reflection moved, but she didn't. The Eliza in the glass tilted her head, studying her with amusement. Then, ever so slowly, she raised her hand and knocked on the inside of the glass. Knock. Knock. Eliza's stomach twisted into ice. A whisper slithered through the air, curling around her like smoke. "You didn't escape, Eliza." Her heartbeat thundered in her ears. "You switched places." The realization struck like a lightning bolt. The real Eliza was still inside. She spun around wildly, looking for proof that this was still her world. But everything felt off. The air was colder, the walls slightly warped, the shadows in the corners stretched too far. And then, movement. She turned just in time to see something flicker past the doorway. A tall, dark shape slithering out of sight. The Watcher. Her pulse pounded in terror. She wasn't back. She had never left. Eliza whipped around to face the mirror again, desperation clawing at her chest. Her reflection was still there, still wearing her face, but it was no longer moving independently. It was copying her again, perfectly, flawlessly. Like nothing had ever been wrong. like nothing had ever happened. A slow, creeping horror wrapped around her as she realized the truth. The thing inside the mirror had taken her place. It had stepped into her life. It had become her. And she was trapped. Panic surged through her as she slammed her fists against the remaining shards. But the glass was no longer just broken mirror. It was solid. Sealed. Like looking at the world through a window she could never open again. The reflection smirked. Then, slowly, it turned away from her. It walked toward the apartment door, her apartment door, reached for the knob, and without hesitation, stepped out into her life. No, no. Eliza screamed, pounding against the glass, but there was no sound. No way to break through. She watched in horror as the door clicked shut behind the imposter. Silence. Eliza stood in the dark void, her breath coming in ragged gasps, her hands shaking against the cold surface of the mirror. She was on the other side now. And then, she felt it. A presence. Something shifting in the blackness behind her. Slowly, she turned. The watcher was waiting. And it smiled.